Hey, welcome. Today on Ask a Pastor, I'm joined by Brady Randall. Brady is our campus pastor at our Butler campus. Welcome, Brady.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks, Kurt.
And today we are going to talk about specifically a question that we've had, and that is, why does Orchard Hill use the NIV as a Bible translation, as its predominant translation in its public services, small groups, all such things like that? So if you're not familiar with Bible translation, the NIV means New International Version, and there are dozens of translations that Christians use today of the original manuscripts. And so Brady and I are just going to talk for a few minutes about translations in general, and then specifically why we use the NIV at Orchard Hill. So Brady, first of all, by the time this airs, the Pirates will have probably played some games.
Yes.
And so just, we always like to ask kind of a fun question. What's your prediction for the Pirates season? I mean, you're going to be part of the way through by the time people hear this, but...
Let's go 30-30,
Okay.
right in the middle.
All
that
right.
would be a big upgrade for a lot of people's expectations.
Okay.
But they got a new regime. Anything can happen in a sprint rather than a marathon. So let's go
Okay.
right down the middle.
And how many of
30
the
and
60
30.
games do you hope to watch?
I'd say 58.
Wow.
Either maybe recorded at some
Okay.
pieces.
Okay, but at least part of it.
Get my eyes on 58 of them. So
Okay,
we'll
that's
see.
impressive. That's impressive.
Yeah.
I recently changed, cut the cord, so I don't have access to games anymore. And so...
Well, I cut my cable, and it dropped my cable initially for like $65 a month. So I'm going to up it again at the end of July.
Okay, in order to get the games?
The savings, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
No
yeah,
sports on. Why pay for
well,
sports?
I don't have a way to even get it now, so it's like it's gone. So, well, tell us about. So you obviously have thought through Bible translation. Tell us what's important for somebody when they're thinking about Bible translation, just to know in general and to understand just when they go to a store or look online and say, which Bible translation should I choose? Help people just navigate that water.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton to choose from, and I grew up. So I was born in 1985, and the church that I was going to at the time was using the NIV, New International Version, the 1984 version. So that's sort of one that I grew accustomed to when I heard the scriptures. That's the one that sounds like the Bible to me. And then I got into the understanding of why you choose different translations, why they change over time as they adapt to different language and the way people hear things. But there's sort of two thought processes on choosing a translation. One thought process is more of a word-for-word translation versus more of a thought-for-thought translation. So in other words, you can... one's like formal equivalence is word for word, dynamic equivalence is thought for thought. And then on the other end, maybe an extreme end more is like a paraphrase of the Bible. And so like a word for word translation is to come to the most like literal word for word as the original language, if it's the New Testament in Greek, versus a thought for thought translation today. So a lot of people think, like, for example, some of the more word for word, like the ESV, English Standard Version, is a little more word for word, whereas the NIV, which we're going to talk a little bit about, is a little bit more of a thought for thought translation of the original. And so there's some debate, which is more accurate, and do you want to be more accurate to the actual wording or the actual intent of what the author was saying? Now, if you go more of a thought for thought translation, there's a little bit more room for interpretive error, whereas that's why some people prefer the word for word. But then someone who's living in 2020, if you go word for word, there's a real disconnect. And so I would say it's helpful to look at maybe two as you're studying, and I would maybe lean to the ESV and the NIV. But that's just a little overview of how choosing
that's well put, and certainly that's what I do personally. Is I read the ESV and the NIV, and then branch from there. But those are the two first go-to. So the formal equivalence or the word for word isn't really word for word, just so we're clear on that, because word order changes, so it's still made readable. But the idea of formal equivalence is to try to say, if the text says this word, we want something in the English text that corresponds to it directly. And then we just translate it and let the people who read it figure it out. The thought for thought says we're going to say, well, what's the thought here? Let's translate it into an idiomatic phrase that is equivalent in the current language. And that's more what the NIV does. So for really intense study, the ESV is actually a better translation. The New American Standard, which is a little older, but is also that. Most of the King James translations would work on that translation theory as well. And so why would we as a church say we want to use the NIV if the thought for thought maybe isn't quite as reliable as the more formal equivalents? And just to other kind of versions that would be in the thought for thought would be the New Living Translation, the NLT, probably the CEB, the Holman Christian Standard would fit in there. And then on the paraphrase side would be like the Message. I think there's a translation now that they call the Passion. That's truly a paraphrase, even though they call it something else, and probably has a lot of doctrinal views in it. The Old Living Bible fits in that as well. So those would be examples of paraphrase. But why would we choose as a church to go with the NIV rather than maybe the ESV or something if we're studying together?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Kurt. And I think it was 2011, which is when the NIV updated from their 1984 version. And some people ask, like, well, why do you update? Once you have it, why keep updating? Aren't you changing it? But the reality is that language changes, meanings of words that once were there changes. There's also a lot of conversation over what we might get into gender neutrality. So, for example, if there's a phrase, history, my history teacher said this is the definition of history. History is the story of man and how he learned to live in the world. Now, that's a very masculine pronoun. History is the story of man, and what we're really saying, history is the story of all of humanity. And so the ESV, I think, almost exclusively would use those male pronouns, whereas the NIV where instead of saying like man might say humanity, if indeed it's talking about male and female. So I think that's one of the reasons. And I think another reason is really getting at, in terms of readability and understanding, especially in a like a congregational setting, a thought for thought can maybe help you get there a little quicker. And then in your teaching, you might go into a little more of the word for word. But I think as you hear it read out loud, often in our study groups, life groups, certainly in public teaching, we'll use the NIV. But maybe you can speak a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, there's a difference in reading level. The ESV, I think, is pitched at an 11th, 12th grade reading level. The NIV at about a 7th grade reading level, which that may feel insulting when you're like, so you're saying we need the 7th grade reading level, but it actually makes it easier to hear it and understand it quickly. Rather than to have some of that translation. The NIV really is an excellent thought-for-thought translation, and it's been honed by a community of scholars over time. And the history of it is, after that 84 version that Brady talked about, is they came out with another version in 2005 that they called the TNIV, today's New International Version, which they tried to go complete gender neutrality. And they actually, in some places, went too far, where they were changing some pronouns that probably weren't well chosen to change. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So then they came out in 2011 with just the NIV. And it was also a marketing issue. People go in and say, well, I want the NIV. And so the reason we decided on the NIV ultimately as our translation at Orchard Hill is, one, it's readable, accessible to everybody. It's been the most popular seller for a long time, so most people have it, which that isn't necessarily a reason to do it, but just saying we want to have something that most people read, to refer to and read together. And then we thought that the gender neutrality of the 2011 version was really done well. And what we mean by that is, if you, as Brady said, if I were to teach from the ESV or even the old NIV, what I found myself constantly doing was saying, well, it says man here, but it means people. And there's a Greek word, anthropos, which is translated man or human, that really does mean gender inclusive in most cases, reference to humanity. And then there's a Greek word, aner, which means man, specifically man. And so the NIV 2011 is actually the best version that I've seen in terms of keeping those distinctions when they mirror the Greek. The ESV, even though it's a more literal translation, takes each of those and translates them man. So it forces you to either know Greek or to go through and try to discern what the context is saying, whereas the NIV 2011 version really takes that out. So when we're reading it and teaching, when the intent of the text is to say all people, the text will say brothers and sisters, man and woman, all people. And so it allows us to not have to go back and explain that every single time, whereas the other versions, sometimes you have to say, well, here this means this and here it means this. And in most of the instances, it doesn't matter a lot other than just using the language of our day, which tends to be gender inclusive, which we believe is a helpful way to speak. So it just seems to be a better version for public use together in our church context. And it probably explains some words a little better for people who maybe are unchurched, which is also one of our heart issues and drivers. We do use the ESV, we study from it, and then use it as a way to communicate and say, here's maybe a finer point on this issue. So that tends to be kind of the backstory of how we got to the New International Version as our version of choice.
Yeah. Kurt, what would you say if someone's coming up for the first time, they're picking up the NIV or the ESV or NRSV, and they have the question, how do I know what I'm reading in the Bible that I pick up is actually the Word of God? In other words, it can be trusted, that this isn't like, is this one translation after another translation? Like, is it like a game of telephone? How do I know what I have is what the original authors? Because one thing people may not know is that we do not actually have the original manuscripts, the original writings of the actual authors. We have copies of copies of copies. But how would you answer the question if someone says, how can I be sure that what I have is what's intended to be God's word to us?
Right. Well, and that's a little misleading when we say we don't have the original manuscripts, because when you go off to college, one of the first things you're handed is a copy of Plato's Republic or something like that. You're not handed it, you buy it at the bookstore or online. But and nobody says, well, we don't have this in the original autographs, so this must not be Plato. But we don't have what Plato wrote in actual copy. We have copies of copies. And the New Testament certainly has more manuscript evidence than anything else from that era. And so what happens is, as you get more and more manuscripts that say the same thing, then you start to say we have a high degree of confidence that we actually have the original. And I may be off on this statistic, but I'm not far off. I think some people have studied this and said over 99% of the words are not in dispute. And so there's only a few words that we have in our whole New Testament that are even in dispute, and most of those are not words that have any doctrinal implication. And so when you pick up a copy, now your only question is the translation accurate, not were they working from something accurate. Now, there are some people who will make the King James only argument and say it's based on better manuscripts, which is just simply not true. I mean, there's just no other way to put that. It's they say the Textus Receptus, the received text, but it was an earlier text, later text, which led to the NRSV, the ESV, the King James, not the King James, but the ESV, NIV, NLT, all of those had more textual evidence, so they're actually stronger. And again, very little difference. And so what you're talking about now is just translation philosophy. And that's why, especially if you don't learn the languages, it's good to look at several renditions so that you can say, if I can make this argument from any translation, then it's a pretty good argument. If I can't make it from all the translations together, then I'm maybe not making a very good argument. The other thing that I would just say is significant, and this is a bias, and you'll appreciate this because you've done the same thing. But if I were a church attender, not a pastor, one of the things that would matter to me is that the pastor of the church I go to, the primary teaching pastor, had a background in the biblical languages, simply because it allows that person to not just be reliant on other people's work, but to be able to go in and study and understand the nuance of what's being argued. And so there's a move today among people who are becoming teaching pastors, lead pastors, to just get their seminary degree and leave the language out. And I would always say that the language, even though it's a lot of extra study, really does help somebody who that's supposed to be what they know, is the capacity to really deal with language. So that's, again, a little bit of a bias, but something that I would find important personally. So what have you found to be helpful in terms of understanding the text and the reliability when people ask you that question?
Yeah, and I think there's different committees. Like when you go to any translation, whether it's any of the ones we've listed, there's different committees. They're supposed to be made up of people from different persuasions, some more conservative, some more liberal, some more evangelical, some men, some women, that they try and get a broad spectrum. And you look at like 5 different committees, some of them with their own agendas. And what's interesting is even though you have that wide spectrum, it's almost all the same text. You mentioned, I've heard like 98.5% reliability. So the question is, we're all coming to sort of the same conclusions. And the fact that we have multiple copies, and I think what I didn't appreciate until recently was how seriously the scribes and the copyists took their work. Like they didn't have even pen and pencil. They didn't have a computer. They sat sometimes with bad lighting, and they were so precise. And if in some of the cases in the Hebrew text, if there was like one error, they would like throw the whole thing out because they wanted to be so precise in handing down what we have today. And so I can't appreciate sitting in a dark room, copying word for word, letter for letter, and some of the variants or differences in the text are simply misspelling, word order, things like that. Very few, if any, is major doctrine. There's a couple things, but what I find fascinating is all these people with seemingly different agendas basically come up with the same text, which I think bears authenticity to it more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. So if somebody is listening and they're thinking, okay, wow, a lot of options to choose from, how would you advise them, other than maybe following their church's position on a text, to decide which text is best for them, which translation?
I like to look at 2, and then even for some personal study, Eugene Peterson is the I don't want to say he's the author of the
He's the sole translator
of the message. And there's some things in there that are a little bit loose, but what I find is sometimes when I take a text and sort of paraphrase what it's saying, that helps me, that's what it says. And I think Eugene Peterson, for the most part, does a pretty good job, at least getting me to think in sort of contemporary terms. And so I've been, I also like the ESV Study Bible as well as the NIV Study Bible, because not only does it give you the text, it gives you what I would say is some very helpful history, background, like what is that and why is that? Not that that's inspired part of the text, but for me, when I'm going just for my own study, the one thing I would say is if you're doing a Bible memorization, I think it's helpful to pick one, because what I found is even when I did some Bible memorization, it was from the NIV 1984, and it would throw me because I would learn this, and that's not the way I learned it, and it would sort of confuse me. So I would say if you're doing some Bible memorization, to really land on one text and keep that, I think that's helpful.
Sometimes it's helpful if you've read the same Bible in the same translation for years. Sometimes it's helpful to read a different translation just to have it hit you differently. And certainly a paraphrase can be helpful. I wouldn't make an argument on a finer point of doctrine out of a paraphrase, but it's helpful, again, just to see things and be shook by them maybe just a little bit again in terms of what could this mean or what could this be about. Well, super. Well, thank you, Brady. And again, if you have questions, you can send them to askapastor@orchardhillchurch.com, and we will be happy to address them in a coming episode. Thanks for spending part of your day with us here today.